So we join together, as we always do, to spend time learning from people's lives in the afternoon of Yom Kippur. And we are very, very honored to have Terrence Roberts joining us today, who will be speaking in just a moment. So this is simulcast over at KI, which was a full house today. So we wish a good Yontif and Happy New Year to everyone at KI. And we wanted to make sure that our community every year gets to hear an inspiration together, even when we're in two different locations in two different places.
I want to take a few moments to acknowledge our sponsors of this afternoon's honored guest. In a way, we started a tradition last year as they sponsored it for the very first time. Charlie and Karen Lyons, they are here. We asked them to sit on the bima, but they like to sit in the back. But I just want them to know how grateful we all are to them for their immense generosity in sponsoring our Yom Kippur afternoon speaker series. I won't commit them for every year, but they do know I'm going to hit them up next year as well. What do you think, Charlie? Usually he says, you had me at hello, so let's hope that's the... We're very grateful to Karen and Charlie Lyons for sponsoring our guest speaker. In memory of Charlie's inspiring mother, Anita Chester Lyons. And for me, it was an absolute privilege to know her. She passed away last June at the age of 92. A little bit about Anita. Truly a heroine in our world, a pioneer. She was a pioneer in the television broadcasting, but also for civil rights. She began her career in the late 1940s as a production assistant to Chet Huntley at KCAL TV. And by the early 1950s, was at CBS News in New York, working as an associate producer for Edward R. Morrow. That can tell you just a little bit about this powerful Eshet Chayil, this powerful woman of valor, and what she was able to accomplish against all odds, certainly back then. Anita ascended rapidly at CBS and in 1954 became the first woman to produce a continuing network news program, Face the Nation. The show's first guest was Senator Joseph McCarthy. In talking about McCarthyism to her son Charlie many years later, Anita said, "Your kids need to make sure it never happens again." These words of wisdom from Anita Chester Lyons ring true today and here on this bima of the incredible hero we are about to hear and experience. And may the memory of Anita Chester Lyons be for a blessing, and it's an honor to thank the Lyons once again for sponsoring it in her memory.
Those of us who grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, the Little Rock Nine are legendary, and they're heroes. But for those of you who might not know as much as some of us, on September 4th, 1957, Terrence James Roberts and 8 other African-American students, known as the Little Rock Nine, made an unsuccessful attempt to enter Little Rock Central High School. Despite the presence of the National Guard, an angry mob of about 400 people surrounded the school. The National Guard was then removed, with the protection of the students left to the local police. On September 23rd, 1957, a mob of about 1,000 people surrounded the school as the students attempted to enter. The following day, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent U.S. Army troops to accompany the students to school for their protection. The troops were stationed at the school for the entirety of the school year, and the Little Rock Nine became the first black students ever to attend classes at Little Rock Central High. In 1999, Roberts and the other members of the Little Rock Nine were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal by President Bill Clinton. Dr. Roberts graduated from Cal State LA with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology. He received his master's degree from the UCLA School of Social Welfare and his PhD in psychology from Southern Illinois University. Dr. Roberts has held various faculty and leadership positions, including Director of Mental Health at St. Helena Hospital and Health Center, and Assistant Dean of the UCLA School of Social Welfare. Dr. Roberts is currently Principal of the management consulting firm, Terrence Roberts Consulting. Please help me give a very warm KI welcome to Terrence Roberts.
Before, give me a mic?
Yes.
Okay. Very good, very good. This is an unusual setup for me. Ordinarily, I don't speak from notes, and I don't have a standing mic. Usually I have a lapel mic or a handheld, and I roam around. Sometimes I'm out there, sometimes I'm up here. Well, at any rate, I will adjust. Before we get too far, when I woke up this morning, I checked my Merriam-Webster word of the day. And you know what that word is, those of you who follow this? Atone. Very appropriate. Very appropriate. In any case, today we're going to talk about forgiveness. The title of my talk is Forgiveness, the Gateway to Lasting Peace. I often use titles to start because it gives me a framework, and then I flesh it out, and it begins to make sense at some point. But by way of full and complete disclosure for this afternoon, it's well for you to know that the words that I share today, and by the way, the written words I have total 1,999. I told my wife, I don't know what kind of sign that is, but I just happened to look down at the end of the page on the computer at that point, and it said 1,999. I said, that's an appropriate place to stop, knowing full well that you get more than 2,000 words from me today. In any case, these words that I will share with you are not meant to be prescriptive, not at all, nor are they intended to be aspirational. At most, they are testimonial. My notions about why I came to an understanding about the power of forgiveness, and what this came to mean in my own search for peace within. This has not been a linear journey, nor has it been without major difficulties in getting me from where I started to where I think I may be going now. Forgiveness initially was not instinctive for me. No, it was not the preferred option in the beginning. You know, I ran through a potential list of responses, and forgiveness, honestly, didn't even make the top 20. I was closer to that end of the spectrum where tit for tat and eye for eye seemed to make the most sense. After all, those spoke of fairness. Somehow they had the ring of making things right. If you punch me in the face, why shouldn't I punch you in your face? Of course, if you refrained from punching me in the first place, I would happily settle for that option. But since there seems to be no reasoning with some people, then I would have to apply what in my world at that time was the natural rule of human interaction: give back in kind. But complications appear immediately with that, all kinds of complication. One cropped up for me very, very early in my life. I remember being out on a Halloween night and watching from a considerable distance two young men, probably teenagers, accosting another young man, single. They beat him up. I watched this. And what struck me about it was, one, it was unfair. I mean, it's 2 on 1, right? There's nothing fair about that. And they inflicted punishment. They inflicted pain on this one young kid. And I thought, this is the scariest part for me, the pain. You see, because I grew up with this notion that I never, ever want to fight, because I'd found out by then that when you fight, there's a possibility that you might get hurt. It didn't have any kind of resonance with me. I didn't want that. But my mom also had told me that as a human being, I had an option to fight, but I never had to fight. She said, for instance, you are an animal, but you're a human animal. And as such, you never have to fight if you don't want to. You have all these other options. You have a brain. You can think. You can reason. You can offer compromises. You can share. You can convince someone that fighting is not in his or her own best interest, whatever you need to do. But fighting is simply one among many options. Well, I thought this is good. I didn't want to fight anyway. But as fate would have it, despite my preference otherwise, I wound up having to fight. Now, well, you need a little backstory to understand this. This all happened in middle school. You know middle school. Oh, my. This is where all kinds of craziness goes on. Young bodies and young minds and constant turmoil zooming around like celestial bodies. You know, inevitably, they're going to crash into each other, right? Well, this happened. There was a kid in my middle school who found great joy in thumping my head. I don't know how he ever came to that conclusion, but he found it satisfying. I did not. I pleaded for relief. I said, please don't do that. It hurts. It's bothersome. Why are you doing it? What's going on? You must stop. He laughed and simply refined his thumping technique. I inaugurated Plan B. You know, Plan Bs are really important because they quickly become Plan As. My Plan B was to change my time of arrival at school. I changed my door of entry. I changed as much as I could to avoid this kid, and initially I thought it was working. But oh no, he was clever. He found me, and he began to thump my head. Now, one day, mostly out of exasperation, when I saw him walking a few steps ahead of me, I called out to him. I said, hey, I need to talk to you. He turned around, and at that point, I modulated my voice. I spoke very clearly and distinctly, and I used gestures. I said to him, if you thump my head one more time, I will hurt you. Then I paused to see if he gave signs that he understood, and my assessment was, based on his nonverbal reply, that he'd gotten it. I mean, after all, there were no middle finger accents, you know. So I walked away proud of myself for having used an option that didn't require fighting. Unfortunately, the next time he saw me, he thumped my head. Now, I confess here and now that what happened then was and is a complete mystery to me in terms of the exact details. Now, the record will show that that kid ended up in the emergency room for some repair of his rearranged physiognomy. What the record will not show is my absolute and utter astonishment that I had the capacity to do that to another person. I was frightened, you see, because I learned in an instant that I had the power to kill another human being. My fear of being injured in a fight found its expression in this extreme case of protecting self against these unwanted provocations. Well, I didn't know what to do with that, but the episode did teach me a lot about myself. And at that moment, I resolved to be more diligent in finding nonviolent ways to resolve conflict. Heightened self-awareness was one of the key elements. Now, if at the time, if I had been more in tune with my mind-body alliance, I could have planned something different for the head thumper. Perhaps I could have intervened in a way that would not have made it essential that he visit the emergency room. You see, earlier I could have convened some sort of a policy meeting between my lizard brain and my frontal cortex to get them on the same page, but I was caught off guard, and these disastrous consequences ensued. Now, little did I know at the time, however, that this whole thing was preparing me for a more consequential confrontation. But before I get to that, I need to tell you a story. I entered this drama we call life in the afternoon of December 3rd, 1941. You know, that's what life is. It's an ongoing drama. Each of us step into it at some particular point in time. And each of you know that time, that date. And that's very important because you come and out of necessity, the biggest thing you have to do is to begin to learn what happened before you entered the drama. See, because if you don't have any notion about what the plot is and what's going to happen, what's the denouement or whatever, you are lost in life. Now, some of what I'm going to tell you, I am basing this on input that I got from others, because as a very young kid, my memory is very fuzzy, you know, especially those very early hours after I'd exited the womb. And by the way, I came from a womb that had been previously occupied, but it was okay because that one occupant had left it in very good condition. So, at any rate, my informants tell me that shortly after I was born, I was placed in a peach basket. Warm bricks were placed there with flannel, and so I was comfortable. I seemed to be able to get along with people. I was breastfed when I got along well with my mom. And what I didn't know at the time was that we, the people of these United States of America, were under orders from the Supreme Court based on a decision rendered in 1896 and still in effect in 1941 when I was born, that we, the people, should interact with each other based on our racial group membership, and we should do this in ways that kept us separate but equal. Now, honestly, the separate part was well established. The equal part, not so much. But there was to be no mingling or consorting between and among different groups based on racial definitions. Wow, things were really in a chaotic condition. But like I said, I was quite young. I didn't know any of this. So all of this I'm learning later on, right? And there was so much I didn't know. For instance, Plessy was not the start of the madness. No, indeed. Plessy was simply a codification of things that had been going on for centuries. We could, if we wanted to, and we will because I want to, go all the way back to the year 1619. Now, that particular date has some resonance, especially with those of us who know the history of this country. 1619 was a date that the very first shipload of African people were transported here to begin a process of free labor, to build the infrastructure that we now know as the United States of America. What that meant for life in Little Rock, lo these many centuries later, because nothing had changed, was that we still had to learn how to navigate this terrain in ways that kept us from being killed on sight in the streets of Little Rock. We, as a family, were forced to live in a section of Little Rock where mostly black people lived. We went to schools that were segregated. I could not attend the local library because that was the exclusive territory of the white citizens of Little Rock. Eventually, during my early years, the library system created what they called the Ivy Branch, which was a very small storefront library in the community where I lived. That was basically what was going on. Lots of other things, but you get the picture, right? But then, as I grew and I learned to talk and I learned to read, I learned to write, I began to do some full-scale research for myself to find out exactly what was going on. You see, because in my mind, as a new person in this drama, I thought, why hasn't somebody changed this? What does it take to look at this and see that it is absolutely wrong? It's not only illegal, it's immoral. Why are we still doing this? Well, I couldn't get much traction. I was still too young. I had to keep learning and keep growing, and I kept doing it. And you know what? It's easy to find. The information is there. You can pick up any American history textbook. It doesn't matter how poorly written it is. It's all there. When I first realized that, I began to look around for the Gestapo. Whoa, because I knew this was contraband. I shouldn't have this. I shouldn't have this awareness, this information. But then as I calmed down, I said, oh, it's okay. Keep reading, keep researching. I found out some disturbing information about what had been going on in this country for so long. And then I became upset because I thought to myself, well, why haven't people protested? Why don't we have people in the streets every hour of every day? Then as I read, I found out that people have indeed been protesting. Oh, no. Even those first people, those Africans who came, were often in rebellion, but those rebellions were put down very quickly. And some of them, you know, historically. Bessie, John Brown, et cetera, et cetera. But I remembered that the Plessy decision itself was actually born out of protest. You see, Plessy was an African-American person. It's very interesting about Plessy because in terms of his physiognomy, you would think he was a white person, but he was officially a black person. And he had purchased a railway ticket to ride someplace, but he was not allowed to sit in the seat that his ticket suggested he could, and he filed suit against the against the company. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court listened to the arguments, and they turned Plessy down. They said, oh, no. I think at that point they decided we better make this plain so everybody knows and everybody understands that this is how it is. And so separate but equal became the law of the land. Well, in 1954, something rather magical happened. In 1954, this same Supreme Court ruled in the Brown decision that it was no longer constitutional to discriminate. Now, pay attention to those words. It was no longer constitutional. You see, because Plessy and all this stuff before that was considered constitutional. And in a way, they're right. When you truly read the Constitution, you see that it was in support of the advancement of slavery. Very interesting concept. Any case, even though things were like that, I saw in this new law, this new decision, this 1954 decision, something that gave me a rather curious new feeling. And I thought there may be light at the end of this tunnel yet. Now, fortunately, I had lived in this country long enough, 13 years by then, to know that I shouldn't get too caught up in euphoria about real change on the horizon. No, I wasn't that naive. But I thought this might be an opportunity for me to use this new court decision as some kind of fulcrum to move the boulder of racial thinking just a bit. After all, anything's possible, right? Well, as I pondered what I might do, the Little Rock School Board gave me an answer. They opted to follow the dictates of Brown. They decided they were going to desegregate schools in Little Rock. Now, initially, they came up with a brilliant plan. They wanted to desegregate kindergarten through 3rd grade. Now, I put it to you, would such a plan have worked? I'll answer for you, yes. Why? Because, I mean, how often have you picked up the Los Angeles International Times, right? Big headline in large font, race riot in kindergarten. Not often. No, not often. But the Little Rock citizens also knew this, and they were upset. And they came to the school board en masse and said, no, 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 you can't do this to us. The school board was forced to give up their reasonable plan, and they came back with grades 10, 11, and 12. And that's when I got involved. I was in 10th grade at the all-black Horace Mann High School. Officials from the school board came, posed the question, if we go through with this plan to desegregate Central High School in September, how many of you will join us? About 150 hands were raised. We all went home then and explained to our parents that we had so volunteered, and those numbers dwindled so fast it would make your head swim. You could hear parental vetoes being exercised all over Little Rock. In the end, there were 10 of us. For a very brief moment, we were the Little Rock 10. But Jane Hill, who was a 10th student, her dad happened to work for a white employer. He received a telephone call with a very terse message, if you send Jane to school tomorrow, do not bother coming back to work. So he quickly pulled her out, thinking this was the way for financial salvation. Wrong, he got fired anyway. Now, I could have told him that, actually. If he'd bothered to call me, 15-year-old kid, I could have told him, get over it, this is it. Well, at any rate, because the school board did what they did, the 9 of us, all high school students, joined the other players in this game. We joined the governor of the state, the members of the White Citizens Council, agitated white citizens of Little Rock, frightened black citizens, clergy, both for and against this whole thing, and a host of other people. And our gambit in this chess game was to respond to violence with nonviolence. Now, we didn't know very much about it, honestly, but some members of Dr. Martin Luther King's team came to Little Rock, Jim Lawson and Glenn Smiley. Those 2 men came, but they were a little skittish about it because we were young and perhaps not able to follow the principles of nonviolence. They worried that we might hit somebody in the mouth. Well, they should, too, because things did happen. But in any case, with the necessary assistance of the U.S. Army, the 101st Airborne Division, we were able to remain in that school for 1 year. Tragically, the following year, the governor, Orville Faubus, closed down all public high schools in Little Rock in the name of segregation forever, which was what his constituents wanted him to do. I can just imagine the governor all year long. He'd been fretting about this because he didn't want us in the school. He said, no, this is a school for white students. We don't have a place for black students here. He didn't know what to do. But then sometime during the summer, this is my imagination, he was, tossing and turning one night in the governor's mansion, just sweating and perspiring and soiling all the government-supported linens. And then he said to himself, I know what I'll do. There was an epiphany. I will close every high school in Little Rock. So he wrote an executive order to that effect. It didn't have Twitter, so at any rate, it all happened. Now, it was during that 57-58 school year that I refined my notions about forgiveness. And I tell you, there was no dearth of opportunity. The 9 of us were targeted from day 1 to the end of that year. I learned first from this experience that forgiveness is not something we do for others. It's what we do for ourselves. It's tantamount to what I learned about fear during that same year. You see, before I learned the truth about fear, I thought other people were making me afraid. Yeah, that's what I thought. Honestly, when I found out the truth, I was blown away. No, fear was my choice. I chose to be afraid in the face of threat of injury or bodily harm of some sort. Very important learning. Now, once I owned my fear, I could stop blaming other people for it. I could choose to forgive. I was no longer compelled to retaliate in kind. I'd like to interject here a little gem I found on the internet. I forgot to write down the person's name, so if you're in the house, bear with me. Not forgiving someone is the equivalent of staying trapped in a jail cell of bitterness, serving time for somebody else's crime. Wow, isn't that wonderful? You don't have to do that. Oh, no. Now, the temptation to lock myself inside one of those solitary confinement units was great, but the thought of being free to control my mental and emotional well-being was much more enticing. And also, as I reminded myself about the cost of not forgiving, I'd learned this from my mom. My mom was a wonderful person, wonderful teacher. She told us, all 7 of us siblings early on, about fighting, for instance. Didn't have to fight because we were human animals. But she also said, you have to think in terms of being willing to forgive, because if you don't, if you harbor bitterness, anger, thoughts of revenge, all of those things, if you think on those things, you're going to use up so much of your life force. And the other person, the person you hate and want to kill, they're not going to contribute anything. You've got to pay double. And so I was convinced I did not want to pay the cost of being unforgiving. Now, the second thing I learned was my need to employ empathy in my relationships with all others around me. I could not justifiably empathize only with those who deserved my empathy. No. I needed to expand my universe. I can recite examples to you endlessly here today about the many times I was beaten up in the halls of Central High School. Now, in some of those cases, on some of those occasions, some of those guys stopped because I think they felt some pang of human emotion that said you can't continue to take undue advantage of a person who's not going to fight back. Not all, mind you, but some. I had to employ other methods for those, which included running, by the way. At any rate, by not returning blow for blow, I learned that I could really begin to empathize and then later begin to understand more about the person who was doing this. Think about it. Here are kids, white kids, who had grown up in a society, in households, with a mindset that said whiteness is better than blackness. And it is important to stamp out blackness wherever we find it. Wow. So by understanding this and trying to figure out, well, how can I help these people learn to deal with things differently? I actually talked to one of the other Little Rock 9 members a few years ago. We were having breakfast in L.A. Carlotta, she actually lives in Colorado. As we sat there having breakfast, I said, Carlotta, how did you cope during that year at Central? Because people were really doing things to us that made no sense. She said, you know what, Terry? I felt sorry for those kids, but I didn't want to give them the impression that I felt sorry for them because I didn't want them to think I was pitying them, but I really did. I thought to myself, wow, what a moment. And I thought about myself, did I do the same thing? And I think so. I think so. I think I cared enough about these kids that in spite of where they were in time and space at that moment, that I could see possibilities. I could see possibilities within them. For instance, my thought might be, what was a life history that so warped this kid's mind that savage aggression is the only answer he can seem to find? Well, at any rate, I have found the peace that comes in the wake of forgiveness. I have learned as well that I am considered by some who find this out that I am warped and totally out of touch with reality. I was interviewed not too long ago by a young reporter at UCLA, Bruin newspaper, the Daily Bruin. Now, I was on faculty at that time at UCLA, and she came on, she made an appointment, and she wanted to talk about Little Rock Central High School. I said, sure, I'll answer questions. So we had a great time initially. She was asking me questions, I was giving answers. And then she got to this question. She said, now, what do you do with your hatred toward white people? And I said, oh, actually, I don't have any. She laughed. She says, oh, yeah, come on now. What do you truly do with your hatred toward white people? I tried to convince her that I did not have that. She became angry. She was so incensed that I would lie to her. She slammed her little notebook shut, stood up, and walked off in anger. I thought, wow, this is very interesting. Now, had she stayed by, she would have been able to hear me recite to her, as best I could, my journey from that point. And admittedly, early in my life, yeah, I may have been angry, but I had learned how to choose other things. What do you do with your hatred? This is actually not so far off the mark from what I get from many people, really. Well, at any rate, I think I'm at the point now where I can forgive a priori. Before it happens, before you punch me in the mouth, I forgive you. Let's not try this out, okay? You know, I have to ask myself, Terry Roberts, well, how is this working out for you, this whole forgiveness thing? Well, I'll tell you another story. My wife and I are tennis players. Well, let me amend that. We both own tennis rackets. And we're often seen together on the tennis court. So there we were one Sunday morning at Caltech, the Caltech courts in Pasadena. There are 8 courts in sets of 2. They're together, courts 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. We, as per usual, were on court 6. We choose court 6, and we get there early in the morning because of the shade. There are large trees at the eastern edge of that court. Both of us are more than likely not to eschew sunshine, if at all possible. So we get out very early, we're playing. We are the only black people on any of the 8 courts, which is usually the way it is too, which is kind of odd in the society, but so be it. At any rate, so we're out there, and I watch, and I'm always aware of my surroundings. So I see a young white male walking toward the courts. And I spot him, and I know where he is now. He's in my peripheral vision. He comes all the way to court 6. He bypasses courts 1 and 2, 3 and 4, comes around 5, and he's standing on the outside of the chain link fence, which is at the eastern edge of court 6. And he leans in and he says, "Hey, do you have cards?" Now, at that point, I am triggered. I go from mild-mannered tennis player working on my weak backhand to homicidal maniac. In a nanosecond, that kid's in deep trouble. Were it not for the chain link fence, well, at any rate, so I compose myself very quickly because I've learned this is part of my routine. I go into my mantra, Terry Roberts, you do not want to commit homicide. Terry Roberts, you do not want to commit homicide. So I walked toward him, and rather than yell out as he did, I speak in that well-modulated tone I use in middle school. And I said to him, do you have a card? And he was not a bit, oh, well, he couldn't find anything. He looked for some means of identification. He could find nothing. He finally points to his jacket. It says Caltech Athletics. I said, well, those jackets are on sale at the student store. Anybody could buy those. But I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I do believe you have been authorized by the university to determine if all players on court are bona fide members of the club. I understand this. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to show you not one card, but two, one for me, one for my wife. But prior to that, here's what I want. I want you to go to court 1, interrupt the play, check the cards of all the players. I want you to do that on courts 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8. At which point I showed him the cards and sent him off to complete his duties. It's amazing. He was very compliant. He caused so much commotion that morning. He still works at the club. I see him on occasion. We've not yet had the talk, but at some point, perhaps we will. Now, I continue to be a work in progress, no question about it. Some days are better than others. But if I am to be graded, I would prefer that my commitment to the ideal be included in the analysis. You see, as humans, we are all imperfect, but we serve a perfect God. As long as we include the creator of this universe in the calculus, we are much more likely to receive a passing grade. On this day of Yom Kippur, may God hear your prayers and grant you the peace of his forgiveness. Thank you.